Everybody, tonight as we continue our Bible study in the book of Exodus, and tonight we're going to try to cover chapter 17, or at least get half of it covered. But we're in the part of the book of Exodus that really focuses on after they're leaving Egypt, God putting them through a series of tests while they're in the wilderness. Having been in Egypt, they have seen God do things that no other human beings have seen God do up into the crossing of the Red Sea. And so going back into chapter 15, we see them after the triumphant song, right? After the Pharaoh's army was drowned in the Sea of Reeds, they cross over into the wilderness, and that's where things are going to get real. They have been tested. And tonight is where, like we've seen already in the book of Exodus, where biblical geography matters. If we are to kind of understand where these events took place in this wandering and the crossing of the Red Sea, where Mount Sinai is. And I posted in the Facebook group that it would be very helpful to go back to Exodus chapter 3 in the part 1 that we produced and watch that, because in that episode we did some cross-referencing and we looked at several passages that either deal with Mount Horeb, which is one name, or Mount Sinai, which is the other name, for the place that Moses had the burning bush experience, and that God told him to bring the Israelites back to that place once they left Egypt. And so that's where they're headed at this point. But in that study, we was able to pretty precisely get an idea where Mount Sinai was, right? And if you're looking at the map here, we know that it's somewhere in this area right here, based on those scriptures that we looked at, somewhere right in this area, which means it rules out one of the traditional sites in the southern Sinai Peninsula. You can absolutely rule that out as a possibility based on what the text says. And either this week or next week, we'll sure enough have a slam dunk, seal the deal case that eliminates that as a location. The other location, if you're looking at the map, is right here, Jebel El Lawz, which is in Midian. And you can rule that out as well as a possible location based on what the text says. And we'll see evidence this week and probably next week that will, again, drive home that case and settle the issue. Another thing that we have learned through biblical geography is that the crossing of the Sea of Reeds had to have taken place on this side, on the western side. I know that we're going to finish watching Patterns of Evidence about the Red Sea, and I know that they're going to put the crossing right over here in the Gulf of Aqaba, and they're going to put Mount Sinai probably here at Jebel El Lawz. It's impossible. If the text is accurate, based on what the text actually says, it's impossible. There is just absolutely no possible way that the Israelites crossed the Gulf of Aqaba, being the Sea of Reeds, and that Jebel El Lawz is Mount Sinai. It just is not possible based on the text. So go back and listen to Exodus 3, part 1, and that'll help you understand better what we actually look at tonight. Because I want to back up just a little bit to Exodus chapter 15, and this is right after their deliverance and the crossing of the Red Sea. In verse 22 it says, "So Moses brought Israel from the Sea of Reed, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur." If you guys remember a few weeks ago when we covered this portion of this chapter, we looked at several cross-references of where the wilderness of Shur is. And the producers of this map got it right, okay? It's right here. And we looked at several passages going back into Genesis that show the only possible location, period, on planet Earth for the wilderness of Shur is right here, which means the Israelites had to have. This in and of itself settles this matter. They had to have crossed somewhere here on the western side, because the wilderness of Shur butts up to the Nile Delta, and where the Israelites would have been as they enter into Egypt. Okay, so we've seen that in chapter 15, and we see that after they get out in the wilderness, they become thirsty after 3 days' journey, right? And when they do find water, it's bitter. And so, they're thankful anyway. And right? No. They complain right away. They forget what God has already done thus far. And at the hint of adversity or circumstances that are not favorable, they murmur and complain. But God does not respond to that with judgment at this point, because he has not given them his Torah, his law, his instruction. And so, the story, we read it. Moses casts the tree into the water, makes it drinkable, and they drink there. They go from Marah in the latter part of that chapter down to a place called Elim. And at Elim, there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there. Now, we don't know exactly where Elim is, but we know it has to be somewhere in the wilderness of Shur, which is up here. So somewhere in this area right here is where Elim would have been. And then last week in chapter 16, it says they took their journey from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came unto the wilderness of Sin. Is how you say that in Hebrew, Sin. We'll see that it's also spelled Zin elsewhere in the Torah. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment. But one thing that I want to point out is that going from Shur, the wilderness of Shur, they go into the wilderness of Sin, and it kind of gives us a location here, which is between Elim and where? Sinai, which is Mount Sinai. So Shur, the wilderness of Shur is right here, and they're headed towards Mount Sinai, which is here, right? Mount Sinai is here. Shur is here. I wonder where Sin is. Somewhere in this vicinity right through here. Okay? And we've seen in chapter 16, in that wilderness, which think desert. I need to just say it because that's really what it is. I mean, barren, wasteland-like desert. Somewhere in that desert, they complain about being hungry, right? And God provides manna each morning. And that particular situation, he provided quail in the evening for them to eat, to be satisfied. And even though they murmured again for the second time, they failed the second test, God does not punish them. Rather, he meets their needs, because that's what God does when you are newly come to the faith. Let's say that they would be, newly come to the faith if we were to parallel it to us today. Okay? And so God is patient because they don't know a lot, right? They haven't received his word. They haven't been instructed. All they've seen is God do miraculous signs that have gotten their attention to believe that, Yahweh is the true and living God. He has judged the gods of Egypt and delivered them. But now God's going to test them and see whether or not they're going to serve him and obey him even when things get difficult. And that's the whole purpose of the wilderness. The wilderness is to teach man not to live by bread alone, not to live by their feelings, their emotions, and their cravings and their desires, but to trust and obey no matter what, because God is faithful. And he's proven that. But they're still learning, right? They're still not fully trusting God. And so when they get thirsty or they get hungry, they complain and God has satisfied their needs. And so we covered that in chapter 16, and it talked quite a bit about manna and how it worked, how 6 days they would gather it, and then they would gather double on the sixth day to have enough for the Sabbath day. So we talked about the institution of the Sabbath in the latter part of chapter 16. Okay, now we come to chapter 17, which is going to be our focus tonight. And we're going to see, again, as I said earlier, where biblical geography matters. And it's going to help us pinpoint and understand where these locations are. And so in chapter 17, it says, "And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeyings according to the commandment of Yahweh." Now, how do they know when to go and where to go? The cloud and the pillar of fire is leading them and will continue to lead them throughout the entire duration in the wilderness, which, as we have looked at the past few weeks, tells us that it has been God's will for them to go hungry and thirsty. Right? I mean, God is testing them purposely in areas of essentials for life. And He's going to see if they're going to trust Him. And so He's still leading them. So they journey from the wilderness of Sin, which is, again, somewhere right in this area. This is where the producers of the map got this wrong, because they have the wilderness of Zin over here, which is the same. In Hebrew, it's actually Sin, but it should be, we'll see here in a minute, right in this area. Okay? So this is wrong. Just ignore that. But so is all of this. I mean, they never went down here and back up here. So again, they really need to hold these producers of these maps a little more accountable to what the text says, because we may not be able to know the exact location, right? Like on Google Maps, the exact pinpoint location. But we can have a pretty good idea of where these places are. So they leave the wilderness of Sin, which is somewhere here, and they're moving eastward, because where are they headed? To Mount Sinai, right? And so let's keep reading. It says, "After their journeyings according to the commandment of the Lord, and they pitched in Rephidim." Rephidim, okay? And it says, "And there was no water for the people to drink." Now, this is an instance where we should be curious, and we should say, I wonder if the Bible mentions Rephidim anywhere else. Because I kind of want to try to pinpoint where these events took place, right? And that's where I can click on this, and in Logos over here, it generates at the speed of a click of the mouse. There are 5 occurrences of this word in the Hebrew Old Testament, and we're going to see that 2 of them are in this chapter, right? Exodus 17:1 and 17:8. And then the next occurrence is in Exodus 19 and verse 2, and you can see that I scroll over it, the hyperlink pops up, and you don't even have to turn to it. But if you were going to sure enough study this out, I would encourage you to go ahead and click on Exodus 19 and read the context, just to make sure you're not cheating. But here it says in Exodus 19, they departed from Rephidim and were come to the desert of Sinai. So the wilderness or the desert of Sin, or Sin, kind of overlaps in part with the wilderness of Sinai. So it's kind of like where Mount Sinai is the end of the wilderness of Sin, or Sin, and the beginning of the wilderness of Sinai. Okay? And so, again, it's mentioned in Numbers 33. Now, to encourage you, if you want to study in order where they camped throughout their wanderings in the wilderness, go to Numbers chapter 33, because it gives a more detailed outline of where they went from place to place. And it will actually mention places that they camped in between some of these places we've covered. that are not mentioned in Exodus. Okay? But those are the only mentions of this location or feeding in the entire Hebrew Bible. And they all occur in the Torah, which is important. Why? Because you have one author, if you accept Mosaic authorship, that talks about this location, which probably explains why a lot of people don't understand where this would have been, because it's really not mentioned elsewhere in Israelite history, right? You could probably go to Israel today and ask a native Israeli that's lived there their whole life, where's Rephidim? And they'd be like, I don't know, right? For one thing, it's not even in Israel. It's close, but not in Israel. Okay? So that doesn't help us completely, but I didn't mention this verse, 17 and verse 8, but it's going to be very important when we get to it. So I'll save that for when we get to verse 8. And the reason why it's important, if you're looking at it, it says, then came Amalek and fought with Israel and Rephidim. Well, we'll get to it here in a second, but let me just say this. The Amalekites, right? The inhabitants of Amalek have to be in close proximity to Rephidim to fight against Israel, as we'll see. That's important because we know for certain, based on numerous scriptures throughout the whole of the Old Testament, that tell us pinpointedly where the Amalekites lived. Okay? And that, again, is further evidence to pinpointing where these events took place. Okay? So we'll return to Rephidim here in just a moment. Verse 2. So there's no water in Rephidim. Verse 2, wherefore the people did chide. They use an upgraded word from murmur and complain. This is a more heated, more intense word. This word chide means to quarrel or fight. Right? There's some anger, some resentment that's involved in this particular word. So the people did chide or fight with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, why do you fight against me or quarrel against me? Why do you tempt the Lord? It's interesting that it is phrased that way coming from Moses, because we do know this for certain, that God is testing or tempting them. Now that's one thing for God to do that. But it's another thing for them to tempt or test God, because we're going to see that God allows them to tempt him or test him 10 times, and the 10th time he says, that's it. You're going to die in the wilderness, and you're not going to inherit the promises that were given to you because you tempted himself, the Lord. So how are they tempting the Lord? They're not trusting him. God is testing them with circumstances that would be difficult. They would be, right? Thirst it has to be quenched. You have to have water, right? It's not like they was wanting a Route 44 cherry limeade. They're wanting water because they are parched, right? They're in extreme conditions. You're talking 100 plus degree heat. And they are traveling, and they're thirsty. And so they're mad at Moses. They're resentful. And he says, why do you tempt the Lord? Verse 3, and the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, Wherefore is this that you have brought us up out of Egypt? Notice every time things get bad, what they want to do. Go back to the place that at one time they despised. The place they begged God to deliver them from, they want to go back to. And so they say, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? Now, don't you think that God had plenty of opportunities thus far to kill them if that was what he was intending on doing? I mean, he could have killed them in Egypt and never brought them out, right? He could have drowned them in the Sea of Reeds. He could have let them starve or thirst to death prior to this point, right? We know they've been in the wilderness over a month at this point. And so what are they doing? They're making assumptions which elevate into accusations, which are a disjustice to the character of God. Now, is God allowing them to go through something that would be hard and difficult for any of us to go through? Absolutely. Absolutely, he is. But is that worthy of him being accused of more than what he's actually doing? So they're offended at God, right? They want to go back to Egypt. They start running at the mouth, right? Accusing Moses and Aaron and God of doing things that none of them are doing. What's happening here? Their emotions are speaking, right? That's never happened to any of us, right? Now Moses, in verse 4, cried unto the Lord, saying, what shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me. It tells you how upset they are, right? Now, at one point, didn't they love Moses? Didn't they think Moses was God's man of faith and power? Right? The leader who had delivered them from slavery and bondage and injustice. Right? They adored Moses. What happened? Has Moses changed, or have circumstances changed? It's important in life when circumstances change, and they will, that we don't see people differently because of it. Because a lot of times when you get overwhelmed by hard circumstances, you can take it out on people. Right? That's what's happening here. They're ready to stone him. Right? Forget Moses. There's no more miracles happening. We're having to walk by faith. Right? Even though manna is still falling from heaven every day, so there are some things still happening. God's still providing. But he's letting them go periods where the rock doesn't produce water for them. He wants to see their attitude. Right? You want to know what's really inside of any of us. Put us in a hard place. Put us in a place where things don't feel good, where things ain't going right. You'll find out what's in your heart. And usually what's in your heart will come right out your mouth. Right? Because thoughts turn into words, and words turn into deeds. Right? So they start thinking bad things, they start saying bad things. The next thing's up is they're doing bad things, and that bad thing is we're stoning Moses. Right? And Moses sees this isn't looking good, because he's pretty outnumbered. Yeah. Except for the fact he's the one who has God on his side. Do you know you're never outnumbered when you have God on your side? Doesn't mean things will go well for you on this side, but where it matters, it will. So he cries out to the Lord. In verse 5 it says, And Yahweh said to Moses, Go on before the people, and take with you of the elders of Israel, and your rod, wherewith you smote the river, take in your hand, and go. Where's he going? Tells us in verse 6. Behold, I will stand before you there upon the rock in Horeb. So what can we gather with certainty based on what we just read? That where they are in Rephidim is close to where Mount Sinai is, which is in this area here. Right? So Rephidim has to be somewhere between the wilderness of Sin and Sinai. Right? Because he's telling, Horeb is another name for Sinai, right? And so he tells him to take your rod, your staff, the one that you use to smite the river, the Nile. Take it in your hand. Verse 6, Behold, I stand before you upon the rock in Horeb, and you shall smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, and the people may drink. Now, it doesn't tell us sequentially when this happens, right? He's just telling him what to do, but it doesn't tell us when this is fulfilled, because the story kind of takes a change here. Let's follow it. He says, finishing verse 6, And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. But it doesn't tell us when. And it doesn't tell us that they all left Rephidim and went to Mount Sinai. So we may be looking at a summary statement that basically says eventually this took place. Verse 7, And he called the name of the place Massah and Merivah, because of the chiding of the children of Israel. Okay, so he called Rephidim, he kind of renamed it Massah and Merivah, because of the fighting of the children of Israel. That's what Merivah means. It's taken from the Hebrew word rev, which means to fight. Merivah is just making it a noun form to give it a place name. Okay, that's what they do in Hebrew. They take what would be the verb form, fighting, and they make it a noun form, right? And it carries the same roots that gives it a meaning, right? They name the place based on what happened there, and that was fighting. Okay, but it also says this. Notice he gives it two names, Massah and Merivah, because they tempted Yahweh, saying, Is Yahweh among us or not? Oh my God. Look at the cloud. Look at the fire. Why are you asking that? You know he's there. Because that is the visible presence of God that is leading you everywhere you go. You just had false expectations that that cloud was going to lead you straight into the land flowing with milk and honey when you don't have the character at all to get there. Of course, they would never admit that, right? They would obviously say, of course we're ready, right? We're not in Egypt anymore. Let's go. But oh, they had so much to learn. But the problem is, as we'll see, they're unwilling to learn. They fail every one of these tests, every single one of them, one right after another, until finally God says, forget it. You guys are going to die in the wilderness. There does come a place and time where God says enough, and he backs up out of the way, and he lets judgment come. Even to his people, right? These are called the people of God. This is Israel, my firstborn son. right? The nation of God's people, Abraham's descendants. And so he names the place that was Rephidim, Massah, and Meribah, which should cause us to do what if we're trying to pinpoint this location? What should we ask? I wonder if either of these names are elsewhere in the Bible. Now, I'm going to go over Massah because there's more important information in Meribah, okay? But I encourage you to do the same with Massah that you're going to see. I'm going to click on it, and over here in half a second, we have a report generated that I can click on this wheel, and we can see every occurrence of this particular word. It occurs 11 times, which is more than what we've seen with Rephidim. And we'll see that it takes the Hebrew word merivah. It can also mean strife, right? That's what the word means, strife or contention or fighting. So we see the wheel has the place name, Meribah, but there's also, look at this. This is important. Meribah Kadesh. Why is that important? Because we're going to see in the Israelite wanderings, there is a place mentioned several times throughout the wilderness wanderings and elsewhere in the Hebrew Old Testament. There is a place called Kadesh Barnea. And obviously, we'll see, it's the same place as Rephidim and Meribah or Massah, which explains why we don't see the name Rephidim elsewhere, because the name Kadesh Barnea dominates as the usage for this location, okay? But I want to click on this wheel just for a moment, and I'm going to click on this part, which is only going to show us Meribah as locations. And you'll see that it's mentioned here, which is what we just read in Exodus 17:7. But it's also mentioned again in Numbers 20. And what's interesting is we're going to see that the Israelites began complaining at Meribah, and they pretty much end the latter part of the wilderness wanderings at the same place, complaining for the exact same thing. This was not only a test for the Israelites, this was a test for Moses too. Now we see that he passed the test here because he cries out to God. But after 39 years of wandering in the wilderness, Moses loses his cool one too many times, and at the same place, he doesn't seek counsel from God, and he smacks the rock twice, and God tells him, you're not going into the land either. Which is interesting that it would happen at this place, because we know this place is Kadesh Barnea, because it was at Kadesh Barnea they dispatched the spies in Numbers 10 that ultimately God said the Israelites, that generation, would all die in the wilderness. So the place of Kadesh is a very interesting place. And so is the name, Kadesh. The word Kadesh literally means in Hebrew, holy or profane. Talk about one word meaning polar opposites, right? It's the same root in kadosh, which we usually see translated in our Bible, holy. So how can it mean holy or profane? Well, I believe that depends on how they respond. They will either be sanctified and set apart because they passed the test and trust God, or they will be profane because they fail to trust God and they are ultimately judged there. Okay? And so this is a very important place. We'll return to the map here in just a moment. But in Numbers 20 and verse 3, it says, this is the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel strove with the Lord, and he was sanctified in them. Now, this mentioning of it in Numbers 20 is the latter occurrence at the end of their wanderings. Okay? In Numbers 20 and 24, that's where God told Moses and Aaron, you guys ain't going into the land of promise either because you misrepresented me before the people. And then it mentions it again in Numbers 27. I'm going to click on this one, okay? So we're going to go to it. In Numbers 27, it says, "For you rebelled against my commandment in the desert of Zin," is how the English spells it, but in Hebrew it's Sin, which sounds super similar in Hebrew to sin. Sin, sin. Sin, sin. Okay, you could see how they would spell it two different ways because it sounds so close, and they lived in an oratory society, and so at some point it could have been written down with an alternate letter there, Samech or Tzadik. Okay? In the strife of the congregation to sanctify me at the water before their eyes. This is the water of Meribah, where? In Kadesh, in the wilderness of Sin, or we could say Sin, right? Because it's at that transitional point of the wilderness of Sin, or Tsin, and the wilderness of what? Sinai, right? Which is basically the wilderness of Sin and Sinai. You just add a letter to the end of Sin and you have Sinai, a yod. You add the letter yod. So very similar wording. And because of these similar wordings being different, that is what has caused some scholars to reject Mosaic authorship. Because they say, and this is a good point they make, if Moses wrote it all, then why wouldn't he use the same place name? Why would he use an alternate spelling, seen and seen? That's a good question, right? But what could happen is in translation or certain portions that were being copied, and perhaps they were being copied orally, at some point they confused Samech with Tzadik, and you have a minor spelling variant, okay? But we've seen, based on what the text says about seen and seen, they're the same location. So we could read the rest of them, and I would encourage you to do that in your own time. But I want to return to the atlas because we know without a shadow of a doubt, no one anywhere on any map you ever find will question where Kadesh Barnea is, because it's so important to Israelite history. And it is right here, which makes sense because where is Mount Sinai? Right in this area right here. Okay? Has to be. Because what we've seen in the text earlier, back in Exodus 17, is he told Moses to go from Rephidim to Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, and he would smite the rock there. So it has to be close proximity, which makes sense. Now, why do I mention all this? Okay? If we know beyond a shadow of a doubt, based on the text we've read, and going back to Exodus 3, those texts we read there, if we know with certainty that Kadesh Barnea is here, which is Rephidim or Massah or Meribah, same names, and it's right next to Mount Sinai, then that means the Israelites could not have crossed, and Mount Sinai cannot be down here. It cannot be. It is utterly impossible. And it sure the heck cannot be way down here. That's just absurd to even think it could be down there. And so this is, again, where if you just do some cross-referencing, simple, with a click of a mouse, if you have a competent Bible software, other ones will do this as well. You can go and read the text and let the text be the text, right? Let the evidence that you find in the text and what the text actually says settle the matter, right? Because we know Kadesh is here, Mount Sinai is in this area here, the wilderness of Sin is here, or Tzin, the wilderness of Shur is right here. It's set in stone. There's no debate. Okay? So, we're going to go ahead and finish this chapter. Y'all are like, don't do it. All right? Verse 8, we're halfway, so we're doing good. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. Notice he goes back to the name Rephidim. Okay? Again, it doesn't shed light on when he went to Sinai and smote the rock and the people got to drink. Because we're back at Rephidim, right? It's kind of makes sense that it was a summary statement that eventually happened, right? You have to come out and say, well, eventually Moses went and smote the rock in front of the elders, and they all would have drank. But verse 8 has them at Rephidim, which is also called what? You got several options. Throw some at me. Masal, Merivah, or most dominantly, and we'll use this as the name going forth, Kadesh Barnea. Or we'll just shorten it and say Kadesh, right? So, okay, look at the map. I'm going to zone in here. They're at Kadesh Barnea. Now, which is the same place as Rephidim, right? Then why do they have, look at this map. Why do they have Meribah down here? Because they have to, because they have Mount Sinai down here. The problem with that is Mount Sinai is by Kadesh Barnea, and Kadesh Barnea is up here. It is impossible, and it is absurd, honestly, to have Mount Sinai way down here. It is just not possible. It is by Kadesh Barnea, in the wilderness of Sin or Sinai, right? This is so simple. This should never have made it on a map. You know why it made it on a map? Tradition. This looks like Mount Sinai. It's, let's call it Mount Sinai. Let's charge people to come visit, right? They can take pictures and say, oh, here's Mount Sinai. This is where the law was given. No, it's not. Stop it. That's why when we go to Israel, I've been on tours, and inevitably they're going to take you to fake sites. And I would be like, I don't want to go to a fake site. This is a fake site. Don't take me to a fake site. Because they're making money off of fake sites. And there are several fake sites when you go there. But some are not in dispute. And Kadesh Barnea is one of those places that's not disputable. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming and insurmountable. So, verse 8 again. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel and Rephidim. Now, what is important is knowing who Amalek is. Who is Amalek? How many of you were here for Diving Deeper Genesis? Y'all are like, shut up. Don't even switch books, right? In Genesis chapter 36, it gives us the genealogy of who? Esau. Esau. You said it. You're right. Esau. And Esau had a son named Eliphaz. And Eliphaz had a son named Amalek. Okay? And again, this is an instance where we could click on Amalek and see there are 39 mentionings of Amalek in the Old Testament. That's a lot more than the rest that we've clicked on. But you could also do a word search on Amalekites and find way more evidence than 39. So together, you could read all of those passages and you could know beyond a shadow of a doubt where Amalek or the Amalekites were. Now, I could torture you to death and do that to you. And we would read all these 39 and we'd do a search on the Amalekites and read all of those just to prove that I'm not making this up. But I encourage you to go check it out for yourself, okay? Don't ever take my word for anything. I double dog, triple dog dare you to prove me wrong. But we're going to look at a map and I'm going to show you where they are. And this is where the map makers got it right. Notice they have the wilderness of Sin right here. And the Amalekites lived right here. The Amalekites, when you study the Old Testament, lived south of Beersheba. What prominent guy in the Bible had several experiences in Beersheba? Y'all are like, I'm going to quit coming if you don't stop quizzing, right?
David.
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right? The patriarchs. But the Amalekites lived south of Beersheba in what is called the Negev. The Negev. Okay? Notice where it is, because we're going to go back to this map. Kadesh Barnea is right here. Whoops. And the Amalekites live right here. Well, it kind of makes sense how the Amalekites could attack them if they're at Kadesh Barnea, which is Rephidim or Massah or Merivah. Now, we have a problem, though, if Mount Sinai is down here. The Amalekites can attack you when you live across several deserts, right? It also is a fatal blow not only to the southern Sinai Peninsula location for Mount Sinai, but also for the location right here, Jebel El Laz. It's a death blow. This passage, among numerous other ones that we've already discussed, totally disprove that Mount Sinai could have been anywhere else than right next to Kadesh Barnea in this mountain range right here. Which one? We don't know. Again, thankfully, because they would set up a shrine or something there and charge people money to go see it. But if you like to hike, you can actually drive right through here. I have pictures, and I'll try to pull some up for next week. Drove through that area more than once, took lots of pictures, and that's really all you can do is drive through it because nobody lives there because it's in the middle of the desert and it's nothing but mountains in this area. And so the Amalekites were right there handy where they could fight against Israel, as we read in verse 8. Okay? So biblical geography matters, and knowing where people lived matters because it helps us pinpoint where these things took place. Now, y'all are like, we don't even want to watch the rest of the Red Sea crossing, right? Because we already know that they're going to try to provide evidence that obviously is going to go against Scripture. But we're going to watch it anyway and hear them out, and then we're going to tell them they're wrong at the end, right? And why can we do that confidently? Because I don't care what they find at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba. I'm going to believe the Bible and someone who was there for those events more than anyone, right? I'm going to believe Moses. He was there when these events took place, and he has told us where these events took place, even though we may not know the exact location of some of these places. Okay? Let's continue. Verse 9. And Moses said unto Joshua, this is the first time his name appears, but he is going to become a very, very prominent role player in the rest of the Torah. And he is going to be the one who succeeds Moses, and he serves Moses during their entire duration in the wilderness. He will be one of the 12 spies that will be sent from this same location, Kadesh, into the land of Canaan to spy out the land. He, along with Caleb, are the only ones who brought back a truthful and honest report that matched God's word. Okay? So Moses said unto Joshua, choose us out men and go out and fight with Amalek, or the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses had said to him and fought with Amalek, which is kind of interesting because they have been slaves all their lives and they're not trained warriors, right? And we don't even know where they would have gotten any weapons from, because even though the Israelites spoiled the Egyptians when they left, it's very doubtful the Egyptians would have gave over their swords and their weapons, right? Silver, gold, vessels, clothes, yeah. What we have to protect ourselves, no. Okay, so we don't know, if what they had available to fight with. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Some have suggested that Hur is the husband to Moses and Aaron's sister Miriam, but we don't know that, but that's something that has been suggested. Verse 11, and it came to pass when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. What's going on here? Good question. Right? You would have to assume he'd have the rod in his hand. When he holds up his hand, Israel wins. When he gets tired and lets it down, they start losing. So let's see what happens here. Verse 12. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. So he sits down, and Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands. So I want you to visualize Moses sitting on a rock with his hands in the air, presumably have his rod or staff. And you have Aaron on one side and Hur on the other side holding up his arms, right? And as long as his arms are in the air, Israel's winning. And so he can't hold them up on his own because, it's going on all day. Anybody ever tried to hold your arms up for hours, right? You can't. You just physically cannot do it. So it shows us that Aaron and Hur come alongside and help, which I believe is showing a team group effort here. Meanwhile, Joshua, the other servant of Moses and Aaron, is out leading the command and the charge to battle. So they have one on one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So this goes on for a while. Verse 13, and Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And Yahweh said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book. You think maybe we're reading that book? And rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. Why rehearse it in the ears of Joshua? Because I think God in his foreknowledge knows what role Joshua is soon to play. For I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. You think the Amalekites made God mad? When you read other scriptural references to this account, I think in Deuteronomy it says that the reason why God was so hacked off about this and vowed to annihilate them off the face of the earth is because they attacked Israel from behind when they were tired and weary. They preyed on them when they were vulnerable, which was extreme injustice, and they were coming against God's chosen people who God was leading on a mission to go into a land that he had promised to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so God says, write this in a book that one day the Amalekites will be wiped off the face of the earth. Now you can read ahead going through the Torah into Joshua. Joshua doesn't accomplish this, but at some point it is accomplished under the rule and reign of King David. Matter of fact, King Saul is removed from being king because he refused to wipe the Amalekites totally off the face of the earth like God had promised right here in this passage that we're reading. And because Saul refused to do what God told him to do exactly how he told him to do it, God removed him as being the king and replaced him with David, who would ultimately do what God had asked. And so as they win this battle, verse 15 says, and Moses built an altar. And we've seen that throughout Genesis as well, where the patriarchs would build altars and call the name, and he called the name of it Yahweh Nisi, which is Yahweh, the name of God, Nisi, my banner or my ensign. Back then, this word probably would have meant my standard or pole. Which is a symbol of victory here for them. For he said, because Yahweh hath sworn that the Lord, or Yahweh, will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Again, this does take place until they're ultimately destroyed under the rule of King David. Okay? But the way verse 16 reads doesn't capture the way the Hebrew reads. And so let's look at some other English translations, because I could show you what it says over here in the Hebrew, but it would be hard for you to get it because you can't read it. So verse 16, it says in the NET, for he said, for a hand was lifted up to the throne of Yahweh. Wow, that's a lot different than how the King James translated it. And it is a better translation. Because what did King James say? Because the Lord hath sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek. The NET says what? For a hand was lifted up to the throne of the Lord, that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Let's look at how the ESV translates it. A hand upon the throne of the Lord. And honestly, looking at the Hebrew, it says V'yomer ki yad al kisei yah, which literally means, and he said, because of the hand upon the throne of Yahweh. That's the literal translation. There will be war, for the Lord with Amalek from generation to generation. So what exactly does that mean? A hand upon the throne of the Lord. Y'all ready for this? Are you ready? This is deep. Get your pencil out. I don't know. I don't know. But I can tell you this. Whatever it means, it's significant, because when his hands were up, it's okay, there it is. It's as if his hands were on the throne of God. Right? And as long as his hands were up, as upon the throne of God, what happened? They prevailed. They won. Okay? And so it goes on to say that they'll have war with Amalek, the Amalekites, from generation to generation. And that is historically known, as I said earlier. So, there you have it. We did it in an hour. Any questions? I got a question for y'all. Does biblical geography matter?
Yes.
It does. It does. Gary.
And in light of that, I have a geography question. When Moses was in Egypt, he wanted to go 3 days into the wilderness to pray with his people, correct?
To worship, to serve.
To work.
Yeah.
And I thought, and I could be wrong, and this would change everything if I am, that meant that it should be a normal 3-day journey to Mount Sinai? Was that where he was intending on ending up?
No, most likely 3 days journey is a euphemism, not literal.
Not a literal. Okay. Yeah. All right. So hold that section's out of the way. That answers that. The next one I can't get around my brain is Deuteronomy 1:2, that Mount Sinai is an 11-day journey to Kadesh Barnea. And if they were that close together, it doesn't seem like to me it would be 11 days. But
he's mentioning right here this parenthetical remark here in verse 2. But you got to back up and read verse 1 though. These be the words which Moses spake unto all Israel on this side Jordan in the wilderness in the plain over against the Red Sea between Paran and Tophel and Lavan and Chatzirot and Dizahav. These names are really not even mentioned anywhere else than right here.
Right.
Okay? Now the question is, where is Moses when he is writing this and speaking on this side of Jordan? Where's he writing this from? Because that goes into consideration. Where do we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Moses wrote the book of Deuteronomy from? Right here. Right up here in this area. Right up in this area. Mount Nebo in Moab. Okay?
Right.
So he is writing from there, from that vantage point.
Right.
Okay? It says, there are 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir unto Kadesh Barnea. So the question is he referencing from where he's writing from, which would be Nebo, which would be from here, up here, all the way down here.
But it says from Horeb.
In the Hebrew, it reads a lot more flexible.
Gotta know more Hebrew. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm with you. That's
It's a lot more flexible. Because it literally says, Achadasar Yom Mechorev Derech Har Seir, which is by the way of Mount Seir. Okay? Which is on the way if he was up here.
Right.
Which is why I believe he's writing from the vantage point of being in Mount Nebo as he's writing this book in the final 5 months of his life before the Israelites cross over into the land of Canaan. And so I think he's writing from that vantage point, and it would be probably 11 days journey from there to Kadesh Barnea or Mount Horeb. Because you could pretty much say Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai and Kadesh Barnea are in the same vicinity.
Right.
I mean, within, rock throwing distance.
Gotcha.
So I believe he's writing from the vantage point of being in Mount Nebo, in Moab. That's the only thing that makes sense. Because we've already proven with a plethora of scriptures, and there's more. I mean, we didn't exhaust it by any means, that Kadesh Barnea is right by Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. It is an impossibility for there to be 11 days journey between Kadesh Barnea and Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. I mean, yeah, it's impossible. But the way it reads, and this will be thrown out, no doubt, this verse will be thrown up when we watch the rest of that documentary. Right? And this is evidence that is taken kind of out of context, out of place, and used for evidence to place Sinai somewhere else. That's one of the reasons why, and I'm glad you brought that up, that's one of the reasons why they have traditionally placed Mount Sinai way down here. Because if it's 11 days journey from Kadesh Barnea, you got to put it as far south as you can get it to come up with 11 days. But not if it's going from here all the way up here. Because this mountain range is tough and rough, and you got lots of desert in between here and Mount Nebo up here. And again, he's talking from the vantage point, 11 days journey, with mass multitudes of men, women, children, and livestock. Okay? So you have to take all of those things into consideration. But that is a very good question based on the way it reads.
Spake, and then down there it said something about the 40th year, so there's they're gonna come.
Yeah, they spend a lot of time in a small location. 40 years. Any other questions? All right.